numerous roles in stage plays, short films, and ad campaigns. And even at her young age, she's already had 15 years of experience in the entertainment industry. She has made ripples throughout the international press for her stance on human rights issues and achieved the National Hero title as a conduit for the retrieval of Hurricane Dorian survivors in Grand Bahama and the Abacos. There were features with her on CNN, Al Jazeera, Business Insider, Vice, and the Washington Post. Her current focus is criminal justice abolition through reduced recidivism rates and writing on the application of historical materialism and leftist sociological theory in the Global South. Her presentation title is The Devil Wears Dashikis, over there, How Social Movements Use Pro-Blackness for White Supremacist Demagoguery.
Okay, thank you. That was a really good introduction. It intimidates me a little bit, but I'll do it. So I'll begin with a quote from Marcus Garvey. So the legendary Pan-Africanist and journalist Marcus Garvey once opined, "All intelligent people know that one's nationality has nothing to do with great ideals and great principles. If because I am Jamaican, the Negro should not accept the principle of race rights and liberty, or the ideal of a free, independent race, then you may as well say that because Jesus was a Nazarene, the outside world should not accept his Christianity because he was an alien." And he's right. Opposition to hateful rhetoric and the endorsement of an equitable society does not suddenly become moot just because of the community that has intimated the discussion. Black class consciousness requires interdiaspora collaboration and Pan-Africanism to thrive because of our collective disenfranchisement and discrimination due to white supremacy and capitalism. But unfortunately, many within the diaspora continue to propagate the colonial concept that only certain nationalities are black, or that we can claim blackness and are deserving of protective legislation, thereby stoking the flames of anti-black nationalism and diaspora wars. So recent developments on social movements and social networking platforms like Facebook and Twitter have created a space for the American descendants of slavery, the foundational Black Americans, and the Coalition of Independence to circulate anti-Black, xenophobic statements under the guise of legislative justice, pro-Blackness, and community-sized upward social mobility. To truly understand how these social movements and their associated bad faith actors propound white supremacy and uphold capitalist framework, I plan to uncover their murky origins, I plan to talk about their legislative demands and the leaders' political affiliations. And I also want to seek to outline the group's internalized white supremacy, which is then externalized through anti-Black xenophobia, birtherism, and the promulgation of far-right narratives to derail productive discourse. After which, I hope to conclude with a sequential guide to the formation of inclusive intersectional movements. What I left out, because it was too long, was talking about how we can, as Bahamians, refuse to acknowledge, or how we can spotlight or take a look at immediately demagogues and saboteurs who actually want to use politics and are issues in our community. So I left that out, but I'll send you all the paper if you're interested. So before we conduct a review of how ADOS, FBA, and COI wield their formidable online and physical presence against their targets, we should define some terms. So social networks are networks of informal interactions between a plurality of individuals, groups, and/or organizations engaged in political or cultural conflicts on the basis of shared collective identities. Social movements diverge from political organizations and interest groups in their reliance on continuous action. So protests, strikes, sit-ins, petitions, all that good stuff. Iconic social movements, like the ones you might know, some of them were mentioned, like Black Tuesday, but also Black Lives Matter, whose protests have always gotten international recognition and have inspired countless protests, and the Occupy Wall Street. Shout out to the millennials in the room for that. They sat in, right? Okay, I see y'all, purr. Occupy Wall Street, the American millennials did a 3-month sit-in on the park, and they got tons of recognition, but the problem with that was they didn't have a clear, direct goal in mind. So after they did that sit-in, nothing changed. So that's what I hope to discuss in our presentation today. But even after that, coalitions like the one mentioned in this presentation are two or more parties who agree to cooperate or pool their resources to obtain some mutually desired income or outcome. And interest groups are financially supporting of candidates who align with their political views for financial gain or legislative favors. So let's get to the real tea. So dialogue on restorative justice, techniques such as reparations for the descendants of Africans who were kidnapped during the transatlantic slave trade have reverberated within the Black community for centuries. It has evolved into a global movement that's interconnecting and always cooperating with assistance from organizations like the CARICOM Reparations Commission, who has, like Dr. Hall Campbell says, Campbell-Dean says, they have a 10-point plan for reparatory justice, which includes the indigenous and African descendant communities who are the victims of crimes against humanity in the forms of genocide, slavery, slave trading, and racial apartheid. So Black sociologists like W.E. Du Bois, he curiously observed that the American government never seemed to seriously consider the correlative loss of wage and opportunity of slave workers, and the tangible results of which, whose exploitation had gone into the planters' pockets for 2 centuries. But its popularity, especially in America, only rekindled following Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's also right there, and his acclaimed Atlantic article chronicling Clyde Ross, who is a Black Mississippian who grew up in Jim Crow. So, 2 years later after this article, ADOS was born, the American Descendants of Slavery. They're commonly referred to as ADOS, and they are now dubbed by diasporic scholars as a Black isolationist ideology that uses the reparations movement to promote anti-immigrant policies, nativism, and birtherism, and disconnect African Americans from the global African world. So, founders Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, however, recount that the movement arose in response to a national landscape rife with yawning racialized gaps, and they want to prioritize reparations for the descendants of chattel slavery in the United States of America. So they believe that their unique racial identifier, they don't call themselves African Americans at all. They believe that by calling themselves ADOS, they encourage legislation that solely caters to themselves while rejecting Africa as their ancestral homeland and shunning Pan-Africanism. Foundational Black Americans, however, is a term coined by a podcaster, and if you love Twitter like me, you know about this social media grifter. His name is Tariq Nasheed, and he considers them to be the real African Americans. They descend from Black Aboriginal people of North America, that is a quote, and I didn't make that up, and the enslaved Africans, I have to specify, hey, y'all laughing, who revolted at the short-lived colony of San Miguel de Gualdape, or Virginia. So not only are they also concerned with lineage, your parentage, and your cultural tradition, but they decry any notion of American citizenship to Black immigrants and their American-born children. So if your mommy or your daddy is Haitian or Bahamian or Jamaican, you are not American to them in any way, and you should not claim that. So those in the Bahamas, however, in the archipelago, we don't need to glance to our neighbors to the north or our neighbors to the west to fathom the veracity of xenophobia and the insidious power of hate. We have our very own demagogue and political grifter in the form of Lincoln Bain and his coalition of independents. Y'all love it. I'm a big hater of this man, I'm serious. So I've dedicated this time, okay? So accurately characterized, shout out to Ashley here, as a perpetual nothing and a failed everything who claws deep out of the bowels of his failure. Bain's xenophobia and birtherism, which is the belief that somebody born in the same country as you does not share the same nationality because of their parentage, it escalated after the Coalition of Independents had a failed attempt to garner seats in the 2021 election. So the pivot to illegal immigration as the primary issue, I got receipts, began on January 22nd, 2020. So first, he live streamed in one of Abaco's alleged shanty towns during Hurricane Dorian or shortly after. And he walked around the community, he filmed their faces, their homes, and then he questioned them about their access to clean water, their access to electricity, and what kind of status they had. And then the following year, he claimed to have returned to the Haitian village, Lincoln Bay in 2021, so y'all know I ain't making this up, to explore and once again film others without their consent. So by 2022, he is catapulted to the forefront of Bahamian political activism, using xenophobia as a springboard, with media articles and interviews on local and national media outlets. So, okay, all right. Okay, so exclusionary activism and anti-Blackness is how they all propelled their brands to the forefront of Black nationalist social media. So ADOS eligibility is for American-born citizens with two parents who descend from enslaved people within the United States. FBAs are the Black Aboriginal people of North America and the Black explorers and traders who had contact with the Americas before Columbus. Comparatively, organic Bahamians, or many members of the COI, they consider themselves as such. After a lot of prodding and questioning, people kept asking, what does that mean? And he posted this little photo y'all got on the side. It's people born inside or outside of the Bahamas to a parent who is also an organic Bahamian. Thank you so much. So I thought I'd put it there. I mean, I don't know what it is, but we rocking with him. So xenophobia and anti-Blackness have always been a tool of white supremacy and wealthy oligarchies to sabotage class consciousness and undermine collective unity. The Anti-Defamation League considers white supremacy as having four things. You have to believe that white people are superior and they should have dominance, especially in non-segregated places, that they should separate themselves from all others, and that their culture and their genes are completely superior to all else. So how does this interact, right, with white supremacy? How do we get there from pro-Blackness? Well, ADOS, FBI, and COI's socially constructed ideology about intraracial conflicts, internalized privilege, and the intolerance toward Black immigrants and the wider diaspora yields anti-immigrant harassment and rhetoric, support of anti-Black legislation that harms our entire community, and it stymies productive diasporic cooperation. Refusal to request reparations for the entire Black community also externalizes white supremacist, colonialist disinformation. It perpetuates a superiority complex, and it whitewashes the effects of the transatlantic slave trade on other regions. The implication that every American descendant of slavery or every American, a Black American of enslaved Africans can successfully trace their lineage is a bit of a fallacy. I mean, the process is so challenging. I did look this up, that genealogists refer to the process of Black people in the United States looking up their history as the brick wall. Because in the United States, you were not considered a human being. So you weren't recorded in the census at all until 1870. So how are you supposed to find this out? So with this in mind, the idea, this proposition that every potential Black American could easily obtain their ancestral proof is impractical at best and baffling at worst. But the Coalition of Independence' use of xenophobia lulls its organic Bahamian followers into believing that they have a way stronger claim to the archipelago than anybody else, and that anyone with immigrant parents should not be getting the same privileges in any way as them. So, prejudice precedes violence. Shout out to Ashley again. So as Bahamian author Ashley Sean Roll declared, prejudice precedes violence. So since the date of that viral video that I mentioned on illegal immigration and Haitian communities, Lincoln Bain's antics have only grown more deranged and more threatening. So one of his most controversial videos depicted him firing gunshots into the air as a warning to Haitians, who he once again charged with the deforestation and burning of trees on Crown land near Bacardi Road on New Providence. And he yelled in that video, "Haitian daddy, don't come back, eh? You hear me? Don't come back." And we serious about that. In January of that year, this year, so that's 2022, we're 2023, Bain live-streamed his verbal harassment of a Haitian mother and her children in their Paradise Island home. He asked about her immigration status and the legality of their housing for the applause of his xenophobic followers, and claimed that there was a shanty town around that area. A month later, he and his sycophants were literally dragged off the premises. Literally dragged, like they snatched this man up, okay? He was dragged off the premises of an alleged shantytown for intimidating residents with the threat, and I quote, "They have 15 minutes to gather their things before we bring this tractor, eh?" They grabbed a tractor and they brought a tractor to the premises and they marked their homes, as you can see on that photo right there, with a little X, whether they were home or not. So what's particularly disturbing about that story is that there's another follow-up article on Eyewitness News about that. The residents were so used to Bahamians being xenophobic to them that they felt the need, which is really sad, they felt the need to justify why they were there. A lot of them were paying rent on that property. And the fact that they felt the need to talk to reporters about them paying rent is insane to me. They should not have to do that. So at that point, I was like, all right, we knew he was crazy, but the pressure's getting worse. So reinvention, right, is a skill done well by grifters, and which Bain, who previously championed the cause of COI, land reform, and a sovereign wealth fund, if you've ever been on his website, before he adjusted to illegal immigration, was well acquainted with. So fear-mongering is a very big tool here. He is using it all the time, and so does ADOS, and so does FBA. It's considered as when the threat of negative outcomes are advertised to be far greater than the actual likelihood. So it's typically used to promote the cause of the COI. So the sentences publicized by Lincoln Bain and his entourage are typically things like, Bahamians are under attack, this country is under invasion, and I quote, "We have a petty minister of national security who is sending the military into the bushes at regular unarmed Bahamian civilians. And he does this to frighten his viewers and his followers, his 29,000 plus followers, I might add, to frighten them into believing that the country is in dire straits." And what makes FAIR such a really good tool in politics is that it's a pre-conscious, pre-rational emotion. It frames your thinking before you can even think about it, regardless of how intelligent you are. And that's by Bayer in 2016. So research by behavioral psychologists Sarah and Jack Gorman, they corroborated this by noting that the first thing potential voters hear, or that the first thing potential supporters of movements hear, it makes the biggest impression on them. And FAIR suppresses the rational part of your brain. So one of the first inflammatory exclamations by Lincoln Bain in 2020 was, and I quote, "Today we come in peace, tomorrow war." So each group is deeply committed to using their nationality, which is inherently tied to their race, as a propellant for legislative access and social capital. So proponents to the cause view themselves and their cohorts as the real Black Americans, right? Or the real organic Bahamians. It conveniently ignores the contributions of people like Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay, right? People who have different parentage, and it considers them an obstacle in achieving any sort of community justice and equity. In the Bahamas, the Coalition of Independence approach of accruing and galvanizing followers through jingoist social media posts before physically gathering, it mirrors that of the COI and ADOS, with the bonus of having a smaller Black population in a concentrated area. So xenophobic sentiments peddled by the American descendants of slavery and the foundational Black Americans, they all mirror this white nationalist slogan. I'm not sure if any of you have heard it before, but "you will not replace us" has become really popular on the far right. And ADOS's Yvette Carnell, who is pictured in that photo, she's actually a board member of the Progressives for Immigration Reform, which is deeply tied to the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which is an anti-immigrant group which was founded by a white nationalist and a eugenicist. And in a scheduled protest this year, Lincoln Bain, outside of the Bahamian consulate in Miami, he said that, and I quote, "Bahamians are being victims of illegal immigrants like Miss Curry. They kick people off their property, they destroy it and their crops, and they threaten to kill them if they came back. So we want to know how many Bahamas there are, because there seem to be two with two different rules for two different people," end quote. So Because social movements rely on actual success on widespread public support, the group's demands would be much more well received using a pan-Africanist approach, including the addition of social movement to worldwide reparations catalogs and coalitions. So there's 5 behaviors indicative of prosperous social movements: emphasis on grassroots organization, recognition of local and national community initiatives, commitment toward evolving social norms and legislation, bipartisanship, and a willingness to collaborate with local businesses. So the Movement for Black Lives, for example, is a pan-Africanist approach. They have supporters from all racial backgrounds, private business partnerships, and a manifesto that demands reparations for all Black people in the United States, regardless of your parentage. So inspirational ideas, must come from social movements with possible courses of action to positively change the world. Rather than look to the xenophobic attempts of the aforementioned groups, researchers at Harvard, they outlined certain steps as well. Define your goals, accrue your allies, and then also identify the institutions, and then move. Finally, you find your path to survive victory. So one of the most dangerous stages of a revolution is after victory has been achieved. People think that that is the end, and it really is not. At the point of winning, you have to strengthen your alliances. You have to renew everyone's support and commitment to obtaining and actually doing the work to have viable change. So, perusal of the circumstances surrounding each group, it illustrates that fear and vitriol are the cornerstones of COI, of ADOS, and of the FBA. It's fear that's kind of justified and understandable. It's fear that people in your own community are being given paltry leftovers while the government pays attention to others. But that's not really the case, right? We're disenfranchising not only others, but ourselves. So at the end of the day, while other websites, for example, FBA doesn't have any demands, ADOS and COI does. They summarize their requests for a more equitable spread of resources and a stronger started foundation for their descendants. So even though they've done these things, using xenophobia, it doesn't work. It just makes people angry. And they're not really achieving anything for their own communities. So at the end of the day, we just have to be better. And that's it.
The kids are all right. Thank you, Ashley Sean Roll, for the best quote that I've heard. Perpetual nothing failed everything. Wow. Ooh, pure fire. Our second speaker will be Mr. Tate Adderley, M. Adderley. Tate is a mission-driven nonprofit professional. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Public Administration and an Associates of Arts degree in Law and Criminal Justice from the University of the Bahamas. He's mainly focused on policy advocacy and empowering Bahamians through education and civic engagement. Overall, he hopes these interests will work for the development of the Bahamas and its people. In the fall, Tate will pursue a Master of Public Policy degree at Northeastern University in Boston, and he hopes to further his education in policy and data analysis to understand the socioeconomic issues being faced by Bahamians. His presentation title is called Independence, a Neo-Colonial Farce.
Can I get the remote, please? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So this presentation came about from a development class that I took in my last semester at the University of the Bahamas under the tutelage of Dr. Yvette Pintard-Nui. And in the course, she had us watch this particular documentary called Life and Debt. And it looked at the case of Jamaica under the IMF Structural Adjustment Program. And from then on, when you do the research, you start to understand that there is a sort of a project happening in the Caribbean, which is very neo-colonial. And you think of the case of Michael Manley in his first term as Prime Minister, and his interaction with Henry Kissinger and the IMF program that came after that. But also the case of Maurice Bishop in Grenada and what happened with that revolution. And so understanding these experiences, I really wanted to try to chart and understand what that project looks like here, specific to the Bahamas. And so this is what I came up with: independence, a new colonial farce. So what I think is important in this is trying to understand first, to see how this project works, and proving this thing as a farce is trying to understand like what was the purpose of independence in the Bahamas. And looking at that, you know, some things that I do recall or understand from the various speeches and the white papers and the conferences was this idea of independence having a meaning of self-determination, sovereignty of internal and external affairs, also charting a new course of development for the Bahamas, as well as establishing a new identity outside of the one that was established under Britain, right? And so the first place where we see this sort of break from that, or the betrayal of these ideals, is specifically our political system, which is very penetrated. And to understand what a penetrated political system is, we first go to James Rosenau, who says that non-members of a national society participate directly and authoritatively through actions taken jointly with society's members in either the allocation of its values or the mobilization of the support on behalf of its goal. But we can also look to Kwame Nkrumah, who talks and he says, in New Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, he says that the essence of new colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. And one way that I think that we can first see this is through foreign direct investment, and how many times, if you look at the laws and the systems in the Bahamas, how we essentially lay the red carpet out for foreign investors when they come to the Bahamas. And I think the Vanguard Nationalist and Socialist Party of the Bahamas kind of aptly describe what the situation is here. And they say, let us begin by stating the most fundamental truth about our situation. The Bahamas today is controlled by a government that is purely and simply a neo-colonial puppet of foreign investors and the chief imperialist powers of the Western world. This is a plain fact. And they go on to say that with no taxes and little regulation, it is a good place to make a quick buck so long as the capitalist doesn't tie up too much capital for an extended period. And earlier I mentioned how, you know, and I think Dr. Bethel Bennett, he talked about the Hotel Encouragement Act, right? And many of the industries acts that are used to encourage the foreign investor to come here and take part in this project at the Bahamas. And so we see that in a system that there is a privilege placed on capital, speculative capital, from the Western world. But also, when we look at how they move throughout the system, it shows that they don't really have a respect for this place, right? And you look at exactly when we have legal disputes over investments and where those are settled. They rarely are settled in the Bahamas, in places like Delaware or New York. So we know the issue with FTX, but we also know the issue with Sarkis Ismaili and Bahama, how that none of that is being dealt with here, okay? And so that is an example of it. But we also look at the situation of Disney and Eleuthera, and particularly the case of the town hall that happened, and talking about that. And I think it was the case of Bahamians showing up in Disney Search, supporting the development. And I just thought that that was quite odd, and I still don't understand the whole situation, but it does show how they move into this place and how they operate. And something that we are seeing that as of late is the situation with Royal Caribbean International and Toby Smith, and how he's being treated as well. And that's another example of how foreign investors are favored, and how they can move freely in the Bahamas as it is a playground. And then we also look at the case of the Bahamian financial sector. And we know all too well of the constant blacklisting of the European Union and classing the Bahamas as a tax haven. But the funny thing about this is that these same countries that places on the blacklisting list are very much so guilty of what they accuse us of. And we know how hypocritical that is. And so I think Rosemarie Belantoine kind of captures what that feeling is. And she says, there's a sense of disconnect, a feeling that we do not and cannot control our own destiny and that our voices are not heard. In those paradigms, small developing countries have little voice and little control over their destinies. We see this, for example, in the negative way in which free trade law constructs have impacted upon our banana industries, our sugar industries, and even our international financial sector. In the next case, I also want to look at foreign policy in the Bahamas, and I sometimes shy away from calling it foreign policy, but I think it's a better term to use about how we act on the international stage. And the subtitle for this is Tony Blair of CARICOM. And I use that specifically because there was a case where some documents were leaked by WikiLeaks. And these were cables that were being talked about in the US Embassy. And there was a conversation between a major PLP financier and a US diplomat official. And the conversation says that basically Perry Christie had hoped to be the Tony Blair of the CARICOM. And if we know who Tony Blair is, we know that he was Bush's right-hand man in the Iraq War and supporting the war. So that is just a subtext of what this whole situation is. And I think a recent case of how we can see how foreign powers sort of move in the arena and how we are sort of cajoled with terms of investment and other fair terms or terms of things that they promise us is a case of Juan Guaido in Venezuela. If you don't know, there was sort of a presidential crisis happening in Venezuela around 2019. After Guaido had, or his opposition had lost in the elections in May 2018, what had happened was a whole issue of the National Assembly, and essentially somehow Juan Guaido considered himself to be the acting president or the fair president of Venezuela, right? And there was this resolution at OAS that happened, and the Bahamas supported that. And in response to that, many of us were confused, and especially it was sort of a, what's the best word to use? It was a difference between CARICOM countries, right? So I think it was the Bahamas, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia supported and recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And many saw that as supporting interventionists and supporting a potential coup in Venezuela. And I don't know if you can read the headline, but many people feel like we did that because investment was being dangled over our heads by the Trump administration. And I don't know exactly what came of the situation. I don't know if we got anything from it, but it's just an example of how we are cajoled in doing certain things on the international stage. Then there's the case of Haiti, right? And what will be the outcoming of that? In CARICOM, they had the resolution, and I'm trying to figure out the solution of what's going to happen with Haiti. And I think it's very concerning. But one thing that I do want to mention, and one thing that we did learn from the WikiLeaks cables from back then, was how that situation was handled is with Perry Christie as well as John Aristide, sorry. And we do know that Christie was sympathetic to the cause of Aristide. And we do know that CARICOM wanted a better solution rather than having Aristide removed from power as he was besieged by the Group of 184. But ultimately, Christie capitulated, and that was that. And Aristide was removed, and I just want to know, and I'm curious to see what will happen with Ariel Henry and the gangs in the G9 in Haiti. So I think where we might possibly see this again happening in the near future is what happens coming out of this issue with Haiti again. And then also, when we look at independence, there was this idea, like I mentioned earlier, of trying to understand what a Bahamian identity was and trying to chart a new course of development for ourselves as a country. And in many ways, we still hold a very much so colonial mentality and identity of how we see ourselves, but also how we see tourists and how we experience tourism. And I think one way that we can see this is the otherization of Haitians. And in this, I think we can look back at the experience of the Bahamas during the Haitian Revolution. And back then, it was the case that many Bahamian slaves, or enslaved Bahamians, were encouraged to tattletale on any plots that were being had, but they also were discouraged from becoming cool or becoming frenzy with Haitian slaves, right? And we sort of see, how that happens. And so we have like the Immigration Act of 1793, where Sean McQueenie describes it as a very draconian act, right? And one of the specific things that happened was that there were taxes levied on the bringing in of slaves from Haiti, right? And so this was used to discourage them from coming to Bahamas because the cost would be too great, and they would encourage them to go somewhere else rather than come to the Bahamas. But there's also a case of Bahamian slaves capturing escapees in 1804, when there was a war between Britain and France, but there was a case where there would be ships being kept with affranchis and Haitian slaves, and they'd be kept in the harbor. And in one instance, we see where those slaves escaped. And what happened was Bahamian slaves went and they captured them, and they were rewarded for it. But there's also the plot against the white authority in 1797, when we know that I think there were about five Haitian slaves that were seeking to overthrow the government of Nassau or cause a ruckus. And what happened was, as a result of us encouraging Bahamian slaves to tattletale, you would see that this plot against the colonial authority was discovered with assistance from local slaves. And it resulted in, I think, about 3 of the conspirators being executed, and I think 2 were deported as a result of that. And we can essentially see the legacies of this mindset. I also like to touch on the detention center and how many immigrants are treated in that place, and we know of the conditions of what it is there. But we also see, as Alea talked about, the demagoguery in politics. And we can think about Lincoln Bain, but I always think about also the Minister administration, what happened, I think, in 2017, where he just came out of nowhere and said that he wanted all Haitians to leave the country by December 31st, 2017. And my question is, where did that come from? Like, why, right? And so we can see the legacies of that as well. And then I also want to focus on the idea of serving the tourist and tourism. And I think it's important to go to Paradise on Plantations by Dr. Ian Strachan. And he says, Bahamians know that when they see the tourists, the government hopes they will behave in a certain way. That when driving, Bahamians should give way for the tourist pedestrian, and that when a tourist asks a question or for directions, they must be nice. They must smile, and they must respond without grumbling. The message is drummed early in the Bahamian child's life. Be polite, be helpful, and smile for the tourist if you know what is good for you. And I do remember growing up in Sunland in grade 5 and 6, and reading the books in tourism education, and you would see where we learn about education, right, and how we should treat the tourists. But we also share space with them. And I live in the East, and sometimes I drive on Fox Hill, and I see tourists in the area, and I question, like, why are you here? Like, why are you in this area? And so with the proliferation of Airbnbs, they're taking up space where I believe they shouldn't be. And that's that. And lastly, I just don't think they should be there, but that's just me. We have, looking at development and maintaining the status quo, where the promise of independence was trying to change the cost of development in the Bahamas. But what happened was that never changed. And sorry for that very small text. But we can see what happened as a result of why this happened as it was in the course of development. And Don D. Marshall in Caribbean Political Economy at the Crossroads says that Caribbean state managers represent an insecure social group, petit bourgeois, with no history of business or enterprise. They feared the politically destabilizing consequences of turning their backs on the wealthy, mercantile elite. They despair over disturbing race relations, and they cannot contemplate broad gauge, long-term development strategies because satisfying the populace and regime consolidation depend on expanding the reservoir of patronage resources. And there's this interesting article that the New York Times published in July 8, 1973, and it asks the question, will independence spoil the Bahamas? And I think it's a very interesting article because it's written from the perspective of a white foreigner. And it's asking questions about and giving credence to the fears of investors and giving credence to the fears of white people and the concerns of what would happen given that we had independence. And there's one point in the article that mentions, Etienne Lepeuch and his talking about, Pinling bringing in communism at one point and stuff like that. But essentially, they had nothing to worry about. And this is a quote from Wallace Groves. He says that, "Sir, the Bay Streeters did wonders for the Bahamas, but times change. Their successes will do greater wonders next year, will be bigger than last year. We're expanding all along the line. We have complete confidence in Mr. Pinling and his able associates. Black power, that's political talk, and that means nothing. They're conservatives." And as a result of that, we see the relentless growth of tourism. We have Atlantis, Bahama, and the cruise tourism, and we see also, again, Disney and RCI. Am I done? 2 minutes? Okay. So two things that we can look at lastly is the legal system. And specifically, some of the things that we see with the Vagrancy Act, like Dr. Bethel Bennett mentioned, the Penal Code of 1924, and the incarceration in the Bahamas in that system. And I draw on two people, which is Dr. Bethel Bennett and Dr. Christopher Curry, and Andrew Lenton, three, sorry. And Bethel Bennett says that despite the claim of majority rule and independence, these laws have never been repealed. They remain constant reminders of ways to maintain law and order in the post-colony. This is one way of controlling or simply criminalizing post-colonial independence. And in response or in term of the incarceration system, Dr. Curry and Lenton says that the history of incarceration in the Bahamas is marked by continuity rather than change. Efforts on the part of the mercantile elite to regulate and control the political, social, and economic spheres of Bahamian society led to people of color being targeted as criminals. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our final speaker for today will be Mr. Dylan Miles. Dylan was born to a Bahamian mother and a British father in 1996. In 2014, he enrolled at the college or the University of the Bahamas after completing his primary and secondary education at Queen's College. Despite graduating with an associate's degree in architecture, he found the field unfulfilling and atomistic. He decided to pursue a degree in psychology. And he began that degree at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. But he found it more holistic and engaging, as it made global issues such as racism, capitalism, and post-colonialism easier to examine. Raised in the Bahamas, he aspires to make a difference and eliminate inequality. His presentation title is entitled Decolonizing Education.
Good afternoon. As said, I'm Dylan Miles, a psychology senior student at the University of the Bahamas. I had the honor of being invited here to my first ever conference to deliver. Thank you. To deliver, as already said, a presentation under the topic of decolonizing education. As if Dr. Campbell didn't do that already. Okay, I'd like to begin by talking about this art piece I did in reference to colonialism. I call it The Is and the Isn't, and it's meant to illustrate the illusory concept of right and wrong. For underlying colonialism is the notion that regardless of all that exists, only specific facets of reality, represented by the white dot in the middle, exist, whereas everything around it, represented by the dark, demonic landscape, which honestly I had more fun drawing, somehow does not exist. To get some formalities out of the way, to have the honor of being here today, I was to submit an abstract, which I did in response to a call for papers. The abstract more so talks about post-colonialism as a social issue, but I don't have time to read through all that now, so I'd like to note that this presentation I actually wrote as a Google Slides document to share with colleagues easily. Also, this, to give credit where credit is due, this presentation is a sort of follow-up to a group project. Okay. I'm not keeping up with myself. This presentation is a sort of follow-up to a group presentation made for Psych 301, that's Indigenous Psychology at UB, taught by Dr. Ava Thompson, which I made with classmates like Azaria Miller, Natisha Bremer, Tamia Raming, so shout out. And that presentation was based on indigenized education in the Americas, which is a major WHO region, but this time I want to discuss the decolonization of education, a subject so good that, so, huge that it was already presented on. I'd like to begin proper with the importance of education for humans. Now, in accordance with certain moral principles, we humans are generally obligated to respect each other's autonomy and freedom to craft our own destinies and make decisions. However, humans, being mammals, require nursing and guidance in the early stages of development, such as in our emotional development, physical, and social development. Societies, therefore, have an obligation to guide newborn generations in the name of a healthy development, as they would be helpless without it. So the key here is that education is a human right. Next. Unfortunately, in our development as a human civilization, it would quickly become apparent that education could serve more as a tool than a human right. After the Industrial Revolution, for example, human children were brought up less in intimate settings like the home and more in efficient ways, such as in schools, where they could be raised in large numbers, almost like a factory line, as befitting of the Industrial Revolution. This would pave the way also for less intimate styles of upbringing and teaching, such as the authoritarian style, which is present in, what else? Colonial education, where such things as physical discipline are allowed for the sake of teaching children. Before we jump too far ahead, though, it's worth noting that, like almost all services offered in society, Like almost all services offered in society, education itself offers two kinds of function, manifest and latent. Manifest functions are the advertised and openly intended functions and include basic things like socialization, which is the process of learning how to behave in a given society, cultural awareness of said society, a sense of morality and the laws of that society, and of course, education is often a mandatory step in a person's career, both academically and if they're working, as many jobs demand you have gone to school. Latent functions in education, meanwhile, are the unintended and maybe unavoidable functions and effects that come with education. When people refer to the hidden curriculum, it would be referring to latent functions of education. These include relationships and how you form them, preferences of politics and political views, which you may hear in school in a neutral fashion, but of course you develop an impression of, and gender roles, which can be overt because schools have dress codes. Many schools do have dress codes, but it can be latent in such phenomena as, say, girls being discouraged from certain physical activities as opposed to boys. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to talk about my own experiences in school. I attended Queen's College, as said, straight through from early learning center to grade 12, graduating in 2014. As it was a private school, it was expensive, with fees as high as $1,000 per semester. This meant it had to be good, right? And indeed, it wasn't that bad. But I'd like to note that I still had some challenges. The curriculum wasn't particularly engaging to me. From English to math to history, everything seemed, or tended to seem, in hindsight, British or American-based. So it didn't mean much to me once I left school for the day, except in homework assignments, obviously. I was bullied. Apparently, I didn't fit a desired image. I would get teased for being mixed race. I would be teased for being too black. I'd be teased for being too white, in and out of school. I wasn't particularly outgoing. I'm still not, and I was shy. So I think this made me seem weak and vulnerable to others. Perhaps not abiding by a certain status quo painted a target on my head. And I distinctly remember, I'm not going to name anyone, but I remember a time when I asked a question in class that I can't remember, but it was called a stupid question by the teacher themselves, and the classmates got in on it. Yeah. One of my favorite challenges was I had trouble following the rules. As shown in the picture, I had an afro back when I was at QC. Nowadays, I have a frohawk, but back then, I just had an afro, which isn't an alien hairstyle, given the region, right? But I was told to cut it constantly, and I just didn't want to because I respected my own autonomy. But I would get in trouble with the teachers and the staff for trying to keep it. Finally, this was a competitive school. QC is known for highlighting its top students in the school newspapers and in outlets outside of the school to give itself a good public image. I wasn't the most enthusiastic student because I was getting bullied and told to cut my hair. So for all intents and purposes, I might have been a bad student. Next slide. By the time I graduated, for whatever reason, I was well enough socialized by the curriculum to believe that white foreign men built society, wrote the best books, and were generally superior in society. I was bullied, and I was never a top student, so it seemed like I was just incompetent or not as good as others. So when I left school, I was uncertain as to what I wanted to do. I took up architecture at UB only because I was told it was a lucrative, field. And at the time, regardless of everything, material success seemed to be the only thing that mattered. I interned for a year. I learned some good skills, and of course, I don't regret the education. But all the while, I was not happy. It felt like I was ignoring something, working under a white British and American boss at the architecture firm, just letting the world mysteriously fall apart around me while trying to make money, because once I left school, I would then find out the Bahamas is not in the best shape socioeconomically. Something didn't feel fair. I was residing in a society that was full of poor or disadvantaged people who were seen as less than others. I wasn't disadvantaged, of course, but people had a problem with, it seemed like I was too different for one reason or the other. And this period after secondary school was honestly one of the darkest times of my life. But my loving and amazing family, hi Mom, kept supporting me for many years. And I kept going. And eventually, things turned around when I took up psychology as my major. I love psychology. I was always interested in it as a social science beforehand. And although the major I was never told it was as lucrative as architecture, and I still get detractors that say, being a couch therapist won't make much, since that's obviously the only job you can get as a psychologist. It was intrinsically motivating, go figure, as a major, and it gave me the opportunity to study the world and its people holistically for once. And it was through this I I learned about a corrupt and malicious entity called colonialism, which opened my eyes, and I never turned back since. Next slide, please. That being said, I did get out easy with my private education, relatively speaking. There are 207 schools, at least 207 schools in the Bahamas, according to Ministry of Education databases. 162 are government-maintained, while 45 are private. The majority of schools aren't private, and yet it's private schools that are considered superior for their education. Not to mention, schools they could be different in many ways. Some schools could be more liberal than others, even though this is a generally conservative system. For what it's worth, Queen's College I did find I was treated more as an individual at Queen's College, so I had a more liberal mindset coming out of school. But there's, with at least 162, government-maintained schools, there is a culture of schools that raise you to be more of a conformist. The majority of schools are Christian, and some still allow for corporal punishment of students, which, as I said before, is an overt holdover from a not-so-bygone colonial era. Next slide, please. Okay, Bahamian education was, and to some extent, still colonial education, as if the whole conference didn't already make that clear. Colonial education was a tool of subjugation, not for teaching. It was set up to provide opportunities for persons serving the colony and not the country. In fact, we need to eradicate this. We need to eradicate holdovers of the colonial education, such as authoritarian relationships between teachers and students, because there are flaws in a system that don't validate such a teaching style, and it crafts obedience in children to even irresponsible adults and politicians. Religious schools today are still generating students loyal to the Christian community, but not necessarily students who wish to help the Bahamian society. Colonialism left the country poor, and the education system it spanned is not a far cry from what came after. An often overlooked notion in our colonial education is that the British frameworks from the British colony weren't dropped in favor of an indigenized one. We ended up importing American textbooks in its place. This is post-colonialism. Next slide, please. It might be hard to see with the character sizes, but this graphic is great. It shows colonization right at the top and the many, many other phenomena and concepts relating to oppression and subjugation that do spawn from it. This presentation this graphic would be worth its own presentation, honestly. So I left the definition of many of the terms in a glossary at the end of the presentation, if that hopefully answers some questions. If education was a tool of colonization, then it was a tool for everything else here, from supremacy to capitalism to trauma, you name it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, to try to summarize the material so far with a point from a dissertation from the good Dr. Campbell. Thanks very much. The education system in this post-colonial era is still steeped in imperialism, which is bad. The capitalist system keeps quality education as an expensive commodity rather than a right to every person. Public schools sometimes do not have adequate resources and tend to engage more in authoritarian teaching practices, most that are not particularly beneficial to the students in terms of engaging them to education. Not to mention, schools across the realm of public and private aren't even consistently educating children in the same way, and this creates many dissonances in society. The There are many ways to spot evidence of an education system once colonized or aspects of colonialism in the education system. The curriculum, for example, may not be totally culturally relevant, as evidenced by the use of imagery non-native to the region. This graphic shows it's a fairly typical counting exercise you'd see in some school books. And while the parrots and maybe even the ducks in the top left and bottom right are something Bahamian students would be familiar with, eagles and owls maybe not so much. Not to mention other things like references to snow are not going to be relevant to Bahamian students, and yet you see it come up in Christmas time a lot. Anyway. Competition is rampant in school. Excessive reliance on competition as a motivator is something that might serve a capitalist dog-eats-dog society more than a utilitarian one. And you might notice that children in school are eager to tattletale or outright bully one another than to empower each other, which has vestiges in colonial slavery. The grading system is somewhat an extension of this, as it turns education into something of an extrinsic motivation rather than intrinsic, a reflection of a society more concerned with results than effort. Unclear objectives and unmanaged expectations in the colonized education system see imported educational objectives in an environment where they are not culturally relevant. For example, most, if not all, schools do offer art classes, but what are the avenues for artists in the country? Finally, teachers and educators tend to be very isolated in their roles in post-colonial education, where they suffer from excessive workload and difficulty even forming relationships with their students or peers by the systems of oppression. What this does to society, I believe, is the following. Creates a population of people with fixed concrete mindsets, which means an inability to relate theory to practice, flex, or creatively solve problems in given situations. Excessive competitive mindsets can encourage inequality outside of it, where persons are more concerned with beating one another in society. And in fact, persons graduating from private schools might find that their interests don't even align with those that graduate from the majority public schools. And they might be inclined to go off to more prolific nations, resulting in something called brain drain. Not to mention, with most schools being Christian, and promoting Christianity as a dominant religion, this creates, dissonances with other cultures beyond the westernized world. Finally, colonialism did bastardize education. If the manifest function of education is to make youth more knowledgeable and culturally aware, how do agendas of capitalism and supremacy help? Okay, so this brings us to decolonizing education. This is the process of undoing colonial influence, in this case, the colonial influence on the education system after independence. It can also refer to the reclaiming of indigenous identity and knowledge, which is more important now than ever before. Next slide, please. There has been some progress. The BGCSE was introduced in 1993, and before this time, less culturally relevant exams were written at the University of London. Cultural relevance, there's been culturally relevant updates to the curriculum. The Indigenous Psychology class at UB is a good example. That was the first time I was introduced to very significant facets of Bahamian society, like people's attitudes towards hurricanes, for example. And the good Dr. Campbell, for some classes, does this, makes bonus assignments where you would attend events, that like forums, shown in the picture was a forum discussing reparations for Haiti. And she would make them a bonus assignment in class, and she would live stream it, which means not only was it somewhat extending the curriculum, it was also being, made to she accommodated it for other classmates. Additionally, Bahamian books have been implemented in the curriculums like Women Take Two in literature classes and An Evening in Guanima, which is referenced in the BGCSE. Other small steps can be done to help decolonize education. No, sorry, not there yet. Sorry, these are big steps that need to be done, very necessary steps to decolonizing education. There's still an overabundance of imported textbooks that talk about the psychology of drunk drivers in the US, but not in the Bahamas, despite that being a serious issue here. The government needs to spend significantly more on education. They spend way more on tourism than education, and though tourism is the primary industry, the graduation rate of the country is inadequate, which many outlets can tell you. And without an obligation to feed a foreign colony, taxes can and maybe should be spent more on education to help locals. And finally, universal access to education, quality education needs to happen. Private schools are just too expensive for many people, and religious schools have arbitrary obligations and strings attached themselves. Both of these can form roadblocks to education in a diversified society. Okay, some small actions that can be done are to keep grades private to reduce, the extrinsic motivation of being at the top of the class, and this reduces excessive competitiveness. Be inclusive of everyone in the classroom. Even if students misbehave or don't seem engaged, they deserve intervention and to be included so that they can receive education just the same as anyone else. And if parents find a curriculum contentious and if they have a problem with it, they have a right to talk to the school boards, and all members of the school system, all stakeholders, should be having dialogues with one another. Oh my goodness, okay. Okay, the benefits of a decolonized education, I believe, would be more open-minded thinkers. This would increase in abstract thinkers would mean more creative problem solving to deal with the socioeconomic issues. A stronger community without as much emphasis on competition, schools, and people on an individual level will have stronger cohesive bonds, even across differing classes. And of course, the value of education is realized as being largely intrinsic, and intrinsic motivation is one of the strongest motivators, then the education system as a whole will be more stable and effective. Okay, to wrap up, these are some projects that since I didn't have much time, these are some projects I would like to suggest or would be interested in, such as, I'm not going to read them all, but one of them is school research, like a qualitative study of just how exactly teachers are engaging with their students in schools across the Bahamas. And also analyzing the link between abstract and concrete thinking and behaviors amongst Bahamians, such as the link to domestic violence. This is a glossary of terms from throughout the presentation, which I hope would answer any questions that come up. If there are any questions, that's it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations. Are there any questions?
This isn't a question. This is a comment and a challenge, okay? I just want to say how indescribably, proud is not even the right word, happy I am that y'all are the future people that might be around when I'm in my old age. So I know that, I didn't talk to Tate beforehand, but I know Tate, so he was probably a little keyed up. And Alea told me she was, and so did Dylan, and y'all had absolutely nothing to be nervous about. You are, so let me just say that when I was your age and I was presenting at my first conference, my content was completely different. It was much less engaged. It was much less, I grew into that. So the fact that you guys are so aware of who we are and where we are right now is very hopeful to me. And that presents me and you with the challenge. Now y'all need to take what happened in the plenary and understand or remember what the role and the purpose of the intellectual in the Caribbean is, and inscribe that on our future. But if you guys are any example, I think that the next 50 years has a little bit of hope. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to share the same comments with Dr. Bethel shared. I think you guys were great, and I think the future is bright. But I do have one question for Mr. Adderley, and this is from a personal standpoint. When I travel, I like to go to the countries and go into the underbelly of the countries, where I can see what the country is really about, and not necessarily the touristic places. But you said that, when you see tourists in Fox Hill, you're wondering why they're there. And I'm wondering now if people, whenever I go and whenever I travel, if they're saying the same thing. So please explain to me, why do you think they don't, why do you ask yourself, why are they there? Don't you want them to experience your country in all facets?
So yeah, I think that was a good question. The reason I say that is because I remember last year when I was leaving, graduated from UB, and I was looking for housing, and I maybe should have clarified what I meant by that more. But the experience of looking for housing in the Providence is hellish. And you can see with the proliferation of Airbnbs in certain areas that I think should be reserved for long-term rentals. And there's this platform I think you should go and look on. It's called AirDNA, right? And if you look at a map of Nassau, and there are purple dots all over the map, and you look at those second short-term renters there are places that I think should be reserved for Bahamians to live and access housing. So that's where I'm coming from. And so my concern is that, I believe that this residential area should be reserved for Bahamians because of the lack of housing in New Providence. And so my question is, while you're here, I think you should be at the hotel. And I understand why you would want to understand the experience of the underbelly of certain places, but I think ultimately what should be the most important thing is the experience of people who actually live there and citizens of the island or the country. And so that's where my concern was, looking at the access to housing and looking at how we have to share space with these people and how they take up space in certain places that I think should be reserved for residentials of the actual island. That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Once again, I wish to applaud the youth and the future of the Bahamas. It's in good stead. It really is in good stead. There is one thing which seems to reverberate, what we can call the elephant in the room, through all of these speeches, all of these presentations. And it is not so much necessarily skin color A versus skin color B, but it seems to be a political philosophy. Over and over, the idea of colonialism unwholly wedded with the big C, capitalism, a naturally exploitative set of rules, shall we say, especially to, well, not really especially, to all three of you and to those who presented before. Should we take the bull by the horns and move away from a capitalist society?
Is this thing on? Oh,
That's on.
yes?
Yes.
Yes.
That's 3 yeses. Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. I want to say thank you to the 3 young persons here in this space. I just had a lot of questions as one of the presenters was speaking, because I am an educator. I work for the Ministry of Education. I've been in public schools about almost 30 years, and my current role is acting assistant director of education. And I have one of my colleagues with me who's also here with us in this space, and we were talking as you were presenting, and there were some concerns we had, at least I know I had generally, because some of the things that were mentioned, I am a defender of education in the public schools. I've grown, all my life I went in public schools, from primary straight up, graduating from R.M. Bailey, COB, had to go off, came back. We don't use corporal punishment in schools. I'm just speaking, it's banned. In the 1996 Education Act, we have presented to the Attorney General with many revisions to the Act. I know myself and Ms. Burrows and some other persons, we did extensive research on it. We've also done many changes that is speculated in the society. We are very culturally relevant. 60% of our content specification is about the Bahamas. We teach not just nationally, but our exit competencies is to prepare students. If you want to go off globally, we teach. Subject areas that I'm responsible for in the humanities, we say that preschool education is free. Once you register a child, you don't have to pay to get in. If your child comes to us and say to us, we do not have the money to pay for BGCSE, the government is obligated to take care of that expense. Okay? We do uniforms because in many communities, a lot of students, we don't want them to be bullied, as you had indicated. They can't afford a lot of good clothing. We provide uniforms for students. We have a huge feeding program, huge free bus service for students on family islands, students who have to connect through keys. Boarding services is free to them. We have a virtual school to access every child and every key and every rock. We are not perfect, but our BGCSE exams are very culturally relevant. It's not just literature, it's not just language. I was a former chief examiner for history BGCSE, and one of the things we did was made 60–70% of the questions related to the Bahamas. Our textbooks, we've been asking assistance from the University of the Bahamas for writers for our subjects. We don't like going international. I mean, Chris Curry, you know, if he's in this space, he and I are working on a major project right now to be a ministry textbook. So it is something that I want persons to understand with public school education. It is not what we would have thought about 50 years ago. You can't take a child and throw the child out of the classroom. That's forbidden. That's taboo. You cannot take a child, even if the child fights, charge before the courts. At one point in time, I worked at C.R. Walker as a vice principal and acting vice principal. A student came with an anklet bracelet, and the union went frenzy. boy out in bail. We were ordered by the judge that that child had to be in school. We have alternative programs. Our girls who are pregnant, they go to PACE. Our boys who before the courts, if we don't send them to reform school, they go to Program Shaw. We have girls who have challenges. We don't put them out. We send them to TAPS. We keep these things because we protect the child. We have children with lots of communicable diseases. We're not allowed to reveal those. If a child is suspended, the child doesn't stay home. They go to a suspension center. So there are a lot of stuff that I hear people put out there. Our curriculum guides are being revised as we speak. I was in and out of meetings all day on my phone with questions as it relates to some of our curricular guides. So we have pacing guides that bring standardization straight across in all subject areas. So how people perceive us is not the education that is out there. And I wish more of my colleagues, because Ms. Boris and I were sitting there, we were back and forth. I said, I have to defend education because that's not where we are.
I don't really have anything to say. I apologize for if I misrepresented.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. I got you. So, no. I thank you for your comments. I'm not here to debate or anything. I love teachers. Some of my best friends and some of the people I respect are teachers. My name is Aji Gal, but don't get this mixed up. This is Hannah Tynes Hasty Gavintine's grandniece in the building. My grandmother is an educator for 42 years. I love educators. I grew up around that, so I understand completely. I just want to say that Dylan's probably talking from a private school perspective, right? Right, so for him, for example, with the QC thing where he talked about his hair, I went to Kingsway, and if you went to Kingsway like I did, you would know that the white and Asian students were able to grow their hair and dye it things like yellow and white and black and brown. So I don't know what was going on there, but that's what we experienced. And then you said the thing about, of course, the punishment, right? I was personally spanked. Tate, I lean over when you was talking, I say, Tate, you get your bungie beat or just me? Because, ouch! Exactly, right. I was spanked, and there was issues in private schools as well. I remember somebody accused me of stealing, and I didn't steal, right? The lady had me strip. I was in 3rd grade. The lady had me strip in front of my class to show that I didn't steal, right? So, like, I know that you're absolutely right. You're in the government school system, and I feel how you feel because you protecting our kids, and I shout out you for that and your hard work. But I just want to say Dylan's definitely talking from that perspective of it, and he talked about that too in his presentation, that even though we have rules, like for some reason, it's like the private schools are not being dealt with according to that. And it's like a totally different world, right? In what world would a child I was like 8 in 3rd grade or 7, because I started school really early, and I stripped in front of my school. So that didn't make, so those types of things will really definitely do that. But even with the BGCSE, so for example, once you said that thing about like the way we're taught, I immediately thought of my own experience too, because at Kingsway, I was taught that slavery in the Bahamas wasn't that bad. So that was actually a part of our curriculum. I'm actually in my 20s, so I didn't graduate 15 years ago. I graduated in 2017 and 2016. No, we're with you. Yeah, we with you. We with you on solidarity. Yeah. I'm absolutely not. That's just me. That's just my personality. I'm diffusing it. No, that's why I led with that, because I know it's easy to be angry in an educational system as an educator when you are talking to people in charge constantly. I know you are, and your suggestions and requests aren't being heard. and you know people, and you're an educator. So you know people ain't thinking that they're gonna hit up the people in charge who are making the decisions. They're rowing you. So I'm just I'm taking up for my boy. I got Dylan back. I got your back.
I want to interrupt you. Our national average is a D.
No, it's not. But it's not though. It's not because and see that's one of the things. Like our national average is a D if you do not take into account that the BGCSE has coursework. If you don't do the coursework, the highest you could get is a C. If you don't have a chemistry teacher, you can't do the coursework to take the exam to get you a B or an A.
I'll be real.
So-
Sorry, Doctor. I just want to
Yeah.
jump in and say I went to a great school. I'm here at this conference. Y'all, you know what? It's time for me to come out the closet. I got a D in the math BGCSE because I did not have a teacher for 3 years at a private school. So imagine people who aren't paying, who just trying to get somewhere, right? So please.
So I mean, that might be what we see, but I think that we have to, when you say the national average is a D, like it's not that simplistic, right? There's a lot more that we're looking at when we say what that D is and how that D comes to be. So Dylan used my dissertation for a lot of his presentation. My dissertation did look at public secondary school teachers. And so one of the things that I think should also be made clear, as Dylan pointed out very eloquently in his presentation, is that culturally relevant has manifest but also latent content. Right? So when we say we are, we're making Bahamian textbooks, we're using Bahamian examples, those are all things that absolutely are being done in the Ministry of Education. But colonialization is something that's insidious, right? So we have teachers that have, by all intent, we don't think for any, stretch of the imagination that our teachers are going in saying, y'all will be good colonial citizens, but they've been indoctrinated within this system. And so the research that I did played that out, But my question was for all of you on the panel that you have demonstrated like a level of passion for the work that you're doing and the fields that you're in that I am not finding amongst most of the students in my classrooms, your peers. How did you get there? And where are they?
You want to ask the question?
So, is there another question, or do I answer? Do I go? Okay. I remember sitting in Payola Alvino's class when I was first in journalism back in UB, right? And she asked people or the class, like, why are you doing this? And I remember just saying the answer, I just like to know things. It's just fun, right? Knowledge for me is collecting knowledge and holding on to things and hoarding information is just something that I'm passionate about. And if reincarnation exists, I would hope I would come back as a librarian sometime in the future. But for me, I also talk about, or lean on my experience being under Dr. Pintar Nuri and being in a class and taking that public administration class, which many law majors tend to fail sometimes. But just experiencing that and seeing and understanding from that viewpoint and policy, what Bahamian society was like. And then I could also talk about Dawn Sargent, who invited me to be on the radio show. And I've been on the radio show, I think, for about 6 years now. And so just being around certain people, like Dr. Bethel, being in classes with Dr. Curry, being around Dr. Bethel Bennett, it's just like you learn from people, even Latino as well. Marjan, Tiffany, you learn from them. And this constant search for knowledge that I have, I think that's a driving force within me, like to know and to understand. And whenever I'm interested in a new subject, I want to know everything about it. And so I think for me, what had happened was I had a driving passion to know, and I was lucky enough to be around the right people who knew a lot and understood what it meant to be a Bahamian and understood what the lived experience of this place is.
I'm with you 100%. I think at the same time too, like the thirst of knowledge that Tate mentioned is something that we have to like cultivate. So at the same time, yes, like everybody keeps telling you, just imagine what it's like to grow up extremely poor. And then while you're growing up poor, people telling you left and right, and all the media you're consuming is like, this is what you have to be, this is who you are, you're nothing. And so you go into school and you go to your class, and you're the first person telling people that they matter. That messes with you. So at the same time, we have to cultivate it from an early age. And then Gen Z, I mean, y'all feel me. We are just generally very angry. So where I feel like if I genuinely had to define, like, come up with an adjective for us, it's just angry. So we don't really have any respect for any of the institutions that, like, generally, like, overall, everywhere. We don't have any respect for any of the institutions that piss us off as a group in this room. So
I want to ask a question.
Yes.
That I think may give some insight. Of the three of you, I'm asking, do you enjoy reading? All right, so generally speaking, I have been teaching in the Bahamas since January of 1991. And I've taught, for a brief time I taught in a public school. I had some 12th graders who couldn't write their name, but we'll leave that to the side. Most of my time I've taught in university. And the University of Bahamas is a very important institution. I love it. I'm a product of it. So many people in this room are. But one of the things that's changed, I think, about young people is it is rare to come across young people, even among the university students, who love to read. Think about it now. You're in university. That's what you're there for. Who love to read, who are intellectually curious, whose reading goes beyond whatever is expected, or who actually even do the reading that's expected. That's a shift. And that's why I want to join everybody else in celebrating the three of you, because you're not the average. You're not the typical. But the challenge for us educators is we need way more of you if we're going to turn this around. And the challenge, it really is a challenge that, young people, and I know a lot of it is cultural, it's media, it's the information age, which is actually not providing people with information. But that is a fundamental key, is our educational system instilling in children at the earliest possible age a love of learning new things and of an appetite and a posture of wanting to learn throughout their lives. All right? The answer to the question is no, it's not producing enough of that. And then the second thing is, and there are people like our assistant director who you can tell she's passionate, she's committed, she loves what she does. We're not producing enough Bahamians, young people, who who have a posture that problem solving is something that they should be doing, who have had experience problem solving, who like problem solving, and have the mind that has been trained to carry out problem solving. Okay? So without that, we're gonna remain in trouble. We have to be producing. So our system, it's still deposit it, give it back to me. You're good to go. That's a problem in terms of creating the generation that we need and the generations to follow who are like, yes, there are problems. Great, let's get busy. and let's go about solving them, which is what we actually need. And that's what we don't have. Yeah. That's what I want to say.
This is the last person, please. We've gone over an hour and a half already. So this is the last one, and then we'll dismiss for the day.
First and foremost, if I may, let me say to the young lady on the panel, you said G.J.T. Tynes is your relative.
Yes.
And his sister, Mrs. Cunningham.
No. My grandmother, Joan. Are you family? So
No,
anyway,
no.
we'll talk later.
You talk about Garvin Tynes?
Yeah, Garvin Tynes.
The
So my grandmother
the
is
educator.
Garvin Tynes' niece.
Yes.
Yes.
The
So it's my
educator.
granduncle.
And he had a sister who was of Mrs. Cunningham.
Oh, purr.
Yes. That was a man that I admired and respected.
Yeah.
So
My family
you
has...
have a hard act to follow.
They literally have
All right?
nothing but wonderful things to say about him.
Yes.
Yeah.
But let me say this, and I give kudos to the Assistant Director from Education, but we have to admit that it is a struggle. Education is a struggle. But let me take it a step further. At this point in our development, if we want to be real, every major system in our country is in need of repair. We are in trouble. Let's acknowledge that. But now, not only must we acknowledge the fact that we're in trouble, we must now acknowledge that all of us, at the end of the day, must put our shoulders to the wheel to make it better. It is a process. We didn't get here overnight. And it's not going to take overnight to get us where we need to be. And indeed, if we can have youngsters or young people like yourselves who are committed, no matter where you are in the world, to contribute to bettering the Bahamas, then it will happen. All right? We must look at the system for what it is realistically and do the repairs that need to be done to get it where it ought to be. I am here, as much as I'm a refugee of sorts, but I cannot, it sounds funny. I'm a Bahamian, but I'm a refugee of sorts, all right? And if you want to see me later, I'll tell you why I feel I'm a refugee. But I will always come when called in service to this country. It has nothing to do with FNM, PLP, or COI. It has to do with me as a raw-born Bahamian who is concerned about every aspect of the development of this country. And I will tell you, I've been in the classroom since I was 17 in 1963, all right? So education is nothing new to me. I've gone through the whole gamut up to the doctorate. But the point is, we have all got to put our shoulders to the wheel, and we've got to stop separating ourselves, millennials and this one and the other one. That doesn't get anything done for a country, because that's separate. We're talking about separation of people. But let's say that we're all Bahamians. We're all in the same boat, and we want the same thing for our country. It doesn't matter whether you're a millennial, whether you are a baby boomer. It doesn't matter. What do you bring to the table to make the country what it ought to be? Thank you.
Come. Chop. Move it along.
Thank you, Nicolette. I want to comment on Dylan's point. I went to QC. Nico went to QC. Legia went to QC. Chris went to QC. Michael went to QC. Each of us had different experiences. I had a hateful experience. It was the nastiest experience I think I've ever had in my life. And it was at the hands of most of the teachers who treated other students much better than they treated me. So their experiences do not negate my experience. I got put on a drug list. They tried to kick me out. My hair was not the right color. And I was like, so I understand what you're saying. I got put out of classes because I was too dumb. And teachers told my parents that I would not amount to anything. So I want us to understand that there is a reality out there that undermines a lot of, especially male students who happen to be mixed or who don't excel at the beginning of school, but do other things. Like I would run outside of school, swim, but let me tell you, getting into that school, oh, it was a nasty experience. Hey, but I survived. I do remember that, though. It was not a fun place to be for a mixed kid.
Thank you for that.
And that brings us to the end of a fantastic, thoughtful, exciting, I don't know what else to say. So I'll see you all here bright and early tomorrow morning. We start again at 9. Those of you who take the bus, remember the bus leaves your hotel between 8